motifs that are going to be true because, all religions, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, there are components that we can agree with.
Yes.
Uh, but like when I was talking with Billy about the Enuma Elish and kind of the parallels that exist between Genesis, it's not the similarities that you capitalize on in that regard. It's the differences that make the difference. With that said, we go on.
Yes. It's a great point. Yeah, and George Lucas, and he was heavily helped by Joseph Campbell, who um, he believes not necessarily in Jesus, but he believes in the symbolic Gnostic view of Christianity.
He at least thinks he has foreseen it all, and that he is in complete control of everything. And though Luke tries to stay calm and resolute before him, when the Death Star becomes operational and begins obliterating the Rebel fleet, fear begins to take hold of Luke as he realizes, and Palpatine tells him as much, that his friends are going to die. And as we of course know, fear leads to anger and anger leads to hate, and so Luke takes up his saber and lashes out against Palpatine to hopefully somehow save those he loves. Like his father before him, Luke's unwillingness to let go of those he cares about seems to be his greatest weakness, and one that Palpatine has exploited brilliantly. The same trick or tactic has now been used against both father and son by the Emperor, who only smiles as everything continues to transpire as he has foreseen. Quickly though, Luke regains his calm and composure and refuses to fight his father, and eventually he hides from him. That's when yet again compassion seems to be Luke's undoing, and Vader senses that Luke has a twin sister, and when Vader threatens to turn her to the dark side, Luke loses it and gives in to the dark side and furiously attacks Vader. And as many people pointed out in their comments, the music at this point is both haunting and beautiful and fits the moment perfectly. The dark side empowering him then, Luke easily beats Vader and eventually cuts off his hand. With his father then at saber point, Luke hears Palpatine tell him that his hate has made him powerful and that he will take his father's place at his side. Then, in one of the best sequences in all of Star Wars, maybe the best, Luke looks at Vader's missing mechanical hand and then at his own mechanical hand and realizes that he is indeed becoming his father. And yet again, Luke chooses death over the dark side by tossing away his saber, refusing to fight any further, and proclaiming himself a Jedi to the Emperor. Palpatine, realizing he's failed and that he can't turn the young Skywalker, then grows angry and decides to kill Luke. But ironically enough for Palpatine, that compassion that he's been exploiting within the Skywalkers for so long now turns out to be his own undoing, as Anakin Skywalker turns back to the light and gives his life in order to save his son. And what brought him back to the light was not only his son's continued rejection of the darkness that he himself had embraced, but because of the belief and compassion his son had in him.
I've accepted the truth that you were once Anakin Skywalker, my father.
That name no longer has any meaning for me.
It is the name of your true self you've only forgotten. I know there is good in you.
Obi-Wan once thought as you do.
Suit your feelings, Father. You can't do this. I feel the conflict within you. Let go of your hate.
It is too late for me.
Not to betray you, Father. I feel the good in you. The conflict.
So, sure, Star Wars has a lot of good components to it. And I think the narrative story is great. But I think we also need to be cautious of the worldview that some of these things are also communicating.
I completely agree with Wes, and I also think that applies to biblical text. So here's another example about, again, referencing Elijah, and this is what the disciples were talking about when they said, should we do what Elijah did? So from there, Elijah went up to Bethel, and he was walking along the road. Some boys came out of the town and jeered at him. Get out of here, Baldy, they said. Get out of here, Baldy. He turned around, looked at them, and called a curse on them in the name of the Lord, which the Lord there is referencing to YHVH, the name that, the religious people in the past wouldn't use, so that instead of saying the Tetragrammaton, they used Lord. Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys, which is wild to me that there was that many kids. This seems to me like there might be a play on numerology. And again, I believe everything has more than one meaning, exoteric to esoteric. So what I see here is we have the power of life or death on our tongue. Like Jesus said, you're crazy. It's not what goes into your mouth, but what comes out of your mouth that defiles you, which is what came to mind when I read this. And then why would a prophet of the true God be calling God to curse kids, and what all loving God would actually have children mauled by bears? And just a short side note to this, I've been called demonic and said, by another Christian telling me I have the spirit of Jezebel on me because I said this about this story. And he said that these children were actually demon-possessed children and they were children of Jezebel. So because I don't have true sight, I need to use false names that were given to us in a book to close these open doors in my mind so I can have true sight. And then in that case, we would have to say that anyone who's demon possessed here should die. Does that make sense? Because it doesn't make sense to me. I think this is a clear example where you have a story from the Old Testament that was referenced by the disciples to Jesus, and in turn, he turns to them and rebukes them and essentially tells them that the person Elijah had as a god was the devil, the god of this world. And so, this is the apologetics that people talk about, where people in religious communities make up all these wild ass excuses as to why evil things are okay and that they're godly and just. I think this is a perfect example of, how Wes and Anton were saying, these horrible people who are leading people astray, like Billy Carson, and it's so dangerous. They're taught, like, these texts show a false light God, and this is what people are worshiping, and they're mixing a fake God with the real God. And this is why you see people in different religious communities, especially after the whole Billy Carson thing, attacking him and the things that they're saying. And with the situation in Gaza, with the genocide that's going on, how people have responded to it, it's because they need a dualistic God. They love the idea of their enemies being cast at their feet and thrown into hellfire. They don't want to believe that there's an all-loving God. They need somebody who's going to carry out their evil desires that they're blinded to, the true nature of what they really want their God to be. And it's like clear as day why Jesus says you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there's no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So by mixing these two, you are actually casting aside the true God, because you can't serve two people. You can't serve an evil God and a God of all love and all light. It's just not going to happen, and this is where not everyone, because there's so many incredible people in the religious communities. But it's always the ones that are the loudest and proudest and the most, deranged to these thinkings that we hear and that we see in the majority of the comments. I've had pastors and things like this attack me, saying that I'm demonic because I'm against genocide, and how dare I, because they're going against God's people. And it's just, it's lunacy.
I'm just a historian who's trying to make sure that people understand what actual history says about these things and what actual Christianity dictates about these things.
This is completely indicative of what I was speaking of. And if truth was the ultimate goal, these things must be addressed. They must be addressed. And this is what Jesus even had to say, but somehow this is again overlooked by different communities or different people rather. If you were Abraham's children, said Jesus, then you would do as Abraham did. As it is, you are looking for a way to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I have heard from God. Abraham did no such things. You are doing the works of your own father. Why does he always say your father? It makes sense to me that we're all under and part of, like Billy was saying, which isn't mystical or anything, we are all part of one God. Why is it so outlandish to say that we could be the creation of a lesser quote unquote God? It makes perfect sense to me, the nature of this world. It makes perfect sense. And they said, we are not illegitimate children, they protested. The only father we have is God himself, which I've heard from, so many people that are like, yeah, genocide. Jesus said to them, if God were your father, you would love me, for I have come here from God. I have not come on my own. God sent me. Why is my language not clear to you? Why don't you get it? Because you are unable to hear what I say. And I believe what he's saying is because you worship dualism. You worship two gods and you can't serve two gods. You can't. You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to truth, and there's no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Yet because I tell you the truth, you don't believe me. Can any of you prove me guilty of sin? Can anyone prove that I'm saying genocide is wrong? Can you prove that that isn't right? You sound like a lunatic when you say that genocide is right because it's going against God's people, as if God only cares about one group of people. That is insanity. Can you prove me guilty of sin? If I'm telling you the truth, why don't you believe me? Whoever belongs to God hears what God says. The reason you do not hear is that you do not belong to God because you have chosen a false God. Now, what is the meaning of Elohim, and who is this YHVH character? Let's get into that. Because the true God of all is nameless. Anyone that has a name is the creation of another. But many others who oppose the truth and are the messengers of error will set up their error and their law against these pure thoughts of mine, as looking out for one perspective, thinking that good and evil are from the same source, the dualistic nature of this world. They do business in my word, and they will propagate harsh fate. The race of immortal souls will go in it in vain, for they shall come out of them, and my forgiveness of their transgressions into which they fell through their adversaries, whose ransom I got from the slavery in which they were, to give them freedom that they may create an imitation remnant in the name of a dead man.